Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, first, it's hard to follow the eloquence of my colleague from North Carolina, and I couldn't agree more with the real urgency that I think she imparted to us with respect to passing this bill. I also have to express my deep dismay about my friend from New York's misgivings about the Cardinals. Given that he's a New York guy, I'm a little confused, but in any event, we'll leave that for another day. And of course, I cannot resist but take the bait here, Mr. Ranking Member, whom I serve with on the Judiciary Committee. I just want to make sure this wasn't, I hadn't planned on it, but nonetheless, given your exchange with Mr. Morelli, on January 12th, there's a January 12th, 2021 article from Yahoo News. It just says, during a House Rules Committee hearing, I was not on the Rules Committee this time, on Tuesday, Representative Jim Jordan refused to answer a question from Committee Chair James McGovern about whether President-elect Joe Biden won the election fairly. So is that, are you saying now that President Biden did win the election fairly?
I'm saying we should investigate and look into it because constituents have concerns, but he's the President of the United States, and I've never disagreed with that. All right.
Well, it sounds like I didn't have any better chance of. It's okay. You answered the question, Mr. Ranking Member. You answered the question. I'll move on.
Let me say one thing.
I will move on.
It's Mr.
Ranking Member's
time, please.
Again, I asked the question. You gave an answer. We'll leave it at that. I would like to talk a little bit about the preclearance provision because I guess I was a little confused by the exchange between Dr. Burgess and yourself, Ranking Member, and so I may have misheard this. Is it your contention that this bill would essentially enable every state in the country to be part of or be subject to the preclearance provision? Is that what you're contending?
Well, I think the Biden Justice Department's been clear. If you made changes last year due to the virus, if you want to go back to what the law was before those changes, which had been fine by definition, if you want to go back to that, they're not going to allow it unless they give you the thumbs up, unless they give you the okay. So that strikes me as, and at the same time, as I pointed out now I think a couple times, the changes that were made that states did, if they want to keep those, which I think many of those changes were done in an unconstitutional fashion by going around the legislature in those respective states, they're not, they won't give us an answer whether they're going to look at that. But if you want to go back to where you were, somehow that's a problem, and you got to get okay from Merrick Garland and the Justice Department.
So,
anything.
If you look at the plain text of the preclearance provision, that is the subject of the bill that we're debating today, which is fairly similar to the 2019 preclearance provision that was adopted as part of the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. There's a nonpartisan analysis that's been done as to which states they believe these individuals, this particular entity, would be subject to the new preclearance provision and which would not. I'm looking at the list here. Alaska was once covered by the VRA preclearance provision. Alaska would not be covered under this particular piece of legislation. Michigan was once covered, wouldn't be covered anymore. South Dakota was once covered, wouldn't be covered anymore. Oklahoma, I know the Ranking Member cares a great deal about the right to vote, served as Secretary of State. He can rest assured, based on the preclearance provision that has been adopted as part of this bill, Oklahoma wouldn't be subject to the provision. Correct, and it would not be added. There are some states that actually would be added, but on balance, my understanding of the legislation, and I suspect there'll be more analysis done regarding this particular piece of legislation over the coming months, is that it would be a net zero impact. That is to say, the same number of jurisdictions that were subject to preclearance before, under the 1965 Voting Rights Act, would be subject today to the John Lewis Voting Rights Act preclearance provisions. There may be different states because of changes in the ways in which those states have modified their respective voting laws over the course of the ensuing 65 years. But I think that carefully calibrated and nuanced approach matters, and it matters for us to be able to make sure that that is gleaned throughout the course of this proceeding. Now, to Chairman Nadler, and of course I want to say thank you for your leadership, and as a member of the Judiciary Committee, I very much respect the work that he has done. It makes sense that this provision is so carefully calibrated because you've taken a great deal of time to craft it. Now, my understanding, Chairman Nadler, is that a similar bill was introduced in the 2019 during the 116th Congress. That's correct?
Correct.
And there were many hearings. How many hearings were there in 2019 before this bill came to the floor?
There were 7 hearings at that time.
7 hearings. And that included not just the House Judiciary Committee, but the House Administration Committee. Is that correct?
Those are additional hearings.
Additional hearings on top of the Judiciary Committee hearings. Then, of course, the bill was reintroduced. Earlier this year, prior to its reintroduction, there were how many hearings within the Judiciary Subcommittee on Constitution and Civil Rights? I don't serve on that particular subcommittee.
There were 6 this year.
6 this year. And that is in addition to hearings held by the House Administration Committee. Is that correct?
Yes.
I can't think of a bill.
They held 5 hearings.
5 hearings. I can't think of a bill that has been the subject of this many subcommittee hearings from 2 different committees of jurisdiction before it has come to the Rules Committee. So I think that this is an incredibly, incredibly important bill. The right to vote is sacrosanct. It is the most important right under our Constitution. It is the right from which all the other rights flow. As John Lewis told us, it is the most powerful, nonviolent tool that we have. We ought to do everything that we can to protect it and to secure it. And that's what we intend to do tomorrow when this bill passes the House. So with that, Mr. Chairman, that's why I'll support this rule, and I'll yield back the balance of my time.
Mr. Chairman.
I'm going to let the gentleman yield back his time and say that, does any other member of the committee wish to ask a question? Mr. Burgess, I'll yield to you to yield to Mr.
I appreciate that, Mr. Chairman, and I thank the gentleman for yielding. I just disagree with where the gentleman from Colorado was at with which states are going to be. The plain language is clear when it talks about practice-based pre-clearance, bottom of page 22, top of page 23 of the legislation. Each state, well, look at the heading, determination of states and political subdivisions subject to pre-clearance for covered practices. Each state in each political subdivision shall, A, identify any newly enacted or adopted law, regulation, or policy that includes voting qualification, prerequisite for voting, and it gives a list, and then says, and, quote, B, ensure that no such covered practice is implemented unless or until the state or political subdivision, as the case may be, complies with subsection C, which means subsection C is sent it to the DOJ. So this is any state who wants to make a change, you're going to have to get the okay, the pre-clearance from the Garland Department of Justice. Even if you want to simply go back to where you were 1 year ago before the virus and go back to that election law, you can't do that without going to them.
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Nadler.
I just want to point out that 2 things. What Mr. Jordan is talking about is population-based, whether it hits a specific trigger in the legislation. It certainly does not mean every state. I also want to point out that he said earlier in opposition to the bill that turnouts are heavy. You know, we had the highest turnout in 2020 as ever, and that may be true, but it's not relevant. The data shows that between 2012 and 2020, the white-black turnout gap grew between 9.2 and 20.9 percentage points across all 6 states originally covered by Section 5. And that shows that Section 5 is needed in different in different jurisdictions as determined by the bill.
Mr. Cole? And then after this, we're going to move on to the next panel. Okay. So we will hear from any amendment witnesses on HR4 at the end of the hearing portion of today's meeting. With that, I'd like to thank our witnesses for their testimony. Please leave with the stenographer or submit electronically anything you would like inserted in the record.
Thank you, Mr.
Gentlemen,
Chairman.
you're now excused.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
More indulging chairman than I am.